of the world's top foreign affairs gurus, Fareed Zakaria.
It takes decades to build trust, and it takes moments to break trust.
The United States recently came out with a new security strategy doctrine.
In this moment of extraordinary power and dominance, Trump's vision of America in the world is to retreat, to shrink, to shed its influence, make America a regional power again.
What does, say, 11 years of Modi compare with in a global context?
He's going strong. Part of it is a weak opposition. Part of it is he's very disciplined. He's reshaped the nature of the kind of master narrative of Indian history.
Hello and a very warm welcome to Walk the Talk. I'm Rahul Kanwal and we are currently in Goa at the sidelines of the Sangam conference, which really looks to build on the India-US corridor. And relations between Delhi and DC have seen more tumult over the past few months than they have over the last several years. Where are we at between India and Washington? Are the trade tensions just temporary turbulence, or are they suggesting a fundamental reset in ties between our two countries? To talk about this, I'm joined by one of the world's top foreign affairs gurus, Fareed Zakaria, looking super sharp in the shades, walking around the beaches of Goa. Fareed, welcome.
Welcome. Always a pleasure to talk to you, Rahul.
It's terrific to have you here. You've had a couple of very insightful days at the Sangam conference trying to build out the India-US corridor. For the last 2.5 decades, it was assumed that ties between Delhi and DC would keep getting better. The past few months have shown that that assumption may not necessarily be true. Are we seeing just some temporary turbulence, or could we potentially be staring at a more fundamental recast?
I hope it's temporary turbulence because let's put it in perspective. For the last 25 years, the United States has made a strategic decision that it wants to have a much closer relationship with India. And that has been a relationship built on the idea of shared values, shared interests, in many ways, the reality of a diaspora, an Indian diaspora that has made America more aware of India, technological cooperation, all kinds of areas where the two countries are kind of natural allies. We are now going through, let's just depersonalize it for a moment, we're going through a period of turbulence around trade. Donald Trump is a very passionate protectionist. He believes in mercantilism and squeezing countries for better deals. And India itself has a history of protectionism. So this is a hard negotiation anyway. You add to it Donald Trump's mercurial, volatile, irreverent personality, and it makes it much worse. So no question, this is a bad moment for US-India government-to-government relations. But I think if you think of that broader context, we're in much better shape. And as you say, the point of, the reason I started this Sangam conference with the help of a few others, Eric Schmidt and Hemant Taneja in the US, Nandan Nilekani and others in India, is to help build the underpinnings of this relationship, So the idea is to strengthen the corridor between India's great tech entrepreneurs and America's technologists, India's great businessmen and American businesses, India's scientific establishment, America's science establishment, because in all those areas, I think fundamentally there's a huge convergence of interests and values, and we could build it out without worrying about what the particular government-to-government momentary spat is or isn't.
Nandan Nilekani said in his concluding remarks that Sangam almost feels like a track two between India and Washington, and that struck me as being very ironical because the kind of countries we've needed a track two with before this are typically India and Pakistan, potentially Delhi and Beijing. We've never really needed a track two with the United States. Now, trade seems to have become front and center of the relationship. So while others continue, say deep tech, defense, technology, etc., we don't seem to be able to cross the line on the trade deal. How far are we at this moment from your lens? There's so much noise. What's the signal you're picking up?
The signal I'm picking up, and now we're all just reading tea leaves, is that there is a deal to be had. At the end of the day, we know what the areas of difficulty are, which largely are around Indian agriculture. But the way I think of it, Donald Trump is transactional. If Prime Minister Modi were to say to him, look, you're a politician, I'm a politician, I can't make these concessions on agriculture. I have elections to face. But in return, here are the things I can do. And then, you know the things Trump cares about. Investment in America, buy some American products, maybe defense products, whatever it is. I think there's a deal to be had. And remember, the most important thing with Donald Trump, it is the announcement of the deal is all he cares about. Mm-hmm. You can announce that you're going to invest $200 billion in the United States. He's not going to check 6 months later how much have you invested. If you look at his history with all these kind of deals, he wants the announcement of the deal. He is not that concerned about the nitty-gritty of following it up.
No, when the US Assistant Trade Representative was in Delhi, he said, India has made very significant concessions and we have a good deal on the table. Then the Indian Commerce Minister stepped out and said, then why don't we just sign the deal? So according to you, and you were reading tea leaves, you said, what is your reading of the tea leaves telling you? Why aren't we being able to sign this deal? Is it about two principals getting into a room and actually getting the deal done?
I think in both systems right now, you have a system where the final decision maker is all powerful and everything waits on a final okay from that person. I can't tell you but I could bet you that the issue is that you need a final okay from Modi and a final okay from Trump. So what really needs to happen is they need to have a conversation. And I think the challenge is, my guess is that in the Prime Minister's office, there's great concern. If you have a conversation with Donald Trump, he's kind of an uncontrollable figure, and he may ask for things, he may say things, and where does that place Prime Minister Modi? So they're going to, I think ultimately the issue is the relationship between these two, and can they land the plane?
No, but look at what happened in the last supposed conversation. We never know what happens, but Donald Trump says, hey, I stopped the war between India and Pakistan, and Delhi keeps insisting publicly and privately, no, you did not. And that really shows how these true, strong personalities can have a disagreement, which then causes major rupture. And from Prime Minister Modi's perspective, it's not his fault, because the facts on the Indian side are Washington did not stop the war. It put some pressure on Islamabad for sure, but it's not as if their pressure dictated Indian action.
I think that this is, again, a case where, look, let's be honest. The fundamental reality is India needs the American market more than America needs the Indian market. India needs the deal more than America needs the deal. So,
but not at the cost of its respect.
Understood. But India is going to have to be creative about addressing this concern that the American president has. I think it is a completely unwise policy that Trump is pursuing. It's this crazy quest to claim that he's stopped all the wars in the world and therefore deserves the Nobel Prize. But, he's the president of the United States. So, you tell me if I'm wrong. As I recall, in previous episodes like this, Prime Minister Vajpayee, for example, would often say things like, we are very thankful that the United States has assisted in bringing this to a close, or in lowering tensions, or in prevailing on Pakistan, or whatever language was used.
Modi.
Right, Vajpayee is not Modi, which gets me to my point. We have strong personalities on both sides of this relationship, and the reality is, Trump is a complicated guy in many ways, but he does understand leverage, and he knows that India needs this more than he does. Now, he may miscalculate and not realizing the point you made, that India is very proud, very nationalistic, and will take economic pain rather than do certain things. But surely there's a creative way to say to Trump, yes, you were very helpful in achieving a ceasefire, without saying you actually brokered the ceasefire. This is what diplomacy is about. These formulations that allow both sides in some way or the other to feel satisfied.
Fareed, I asked this question to Dr. Jaishankar at the Hindustan Times Leadership Summit, and he said that India simply cannot do the kind of things that Pakistan did, buy cryptocurrency, nominate Trump for the Nobel Prize. So it's a very unequal situation where Pakistan's, it's a basket case country. They can say whatever they want to please Trump. In India, Modi's got democracy, all his voters, he's careful of his own image. He can't say the kind of stuff that Pakistan is.
I agree, and I think it's to India's credit that it's not a country like that, where you can't have these kind of wheeling dealing, these deals. And so what India has to play for is that it is a serious country with a serious foreign policy, with serious negotiators, but who are also skilled at arriving at making a deal, not through, kind of obsequious flattery and, kind of various forms of payments and this, that, and the other, but rather through the strength of the position, a creative way to come out to bridge a difference. Look, Trump does make deals, if you look at with China, if you look at even with the European Union. And in all of those cases, he respects a certain strength and steadiness. So India is smaller economically, but I think if it comes across as strong, steady, competent, intelligent, I think there's a path forward.
We've spoken about the India-US relation. Let's spend a moment talking about the US and China relationship. For a long time, it was said that the one thing that's holding China back in the AI race is because they don't have access to the most advanced NVIDIA chips. Now Trump's handing over those chips to Beijing on a platter. Is that just economic, technical, technological harakiri?
I think it's a mistake. I wouldn't describe it as strongly as that. But, Trump has moved in a number of bewildering ways on this. And I think one way to think about this is Trump seems to view the China relationship and China essentially just through economic lenses. He just looks at China and says, if I can make a deal, they're a big economy, I'm a big economy, we can prosper, and there's no problem. And he's a little worried about critical minerals and things like that, where the US needs to be able to supply them. But he doesn't seem as focused on the fact that, China is going to quadruple or quintuple its nuclear arsenal in the next 10 or 15 years. It is engaged in a very, very significant military buildup. I think by some measures, it is the largest military buildup in modern history over the last 20 years. So China has for a long time been geostrategically rising and searching for influence. It's searching for bases.
But Washington cannot look at China just from an economic lens.
This is my point. So the puzzling part here is, the issue is, do you want to help China not just accelerate its AI development, but use these chips in the Chinese military, in military and defense technologies, which they clearly will do. And so there's a potential that American technology will be used against it in a clash over Taiwan. So I am a proponent of not having too many barriers to trade, even in the name of national security. But
you can't think of your enemies as your friends.
Right. These core technologies, which have military applications, it seemed to me you have to withhold them, because otherwise you are empowering the military of an adversarial power.
The United States recently came out with a new security strategy doctrine. And the broad sense to commentators seems to be that is the US now moving away from wanting to be a global superpower, the super cop of the world, to essentially repositioning itself as a power for the region, for the Americas, rather than thinking of the whole world? And how much of a mistake do you see that as being?
Yeah, you put it exactly right. To me, the puzzling piece about this, Rahul, is the US is dominant in the world, right? If you look at where the US is vis-a-vis Europe, 25 years ago, roughly speaking, Eurozone, Europe, and the US economies were the same size. Germany and US roughly the same per capita GDP. US is now double the Eurozone economy. It's 50% higher wages than European countries. Europe is poor in comparison to the US now. US technology dominates the world. US tech companies have market caps that are larger than the entire stock exchange of Germany. And yet, in this moment of extraordinary power and dominance, Trump's vision of America in the world is to retreat, to shrink, to shed its influence. I've been thinking about this, that the title of the National Security Strategy document that Trump has put out could be "Make America a Regional Power Again." Mm-hmm. For 80 years, it's been a global power. We want to be a regional power. And in what region? Latin America, which is economically of almost no consequence to the United States. You have a bunch of small economies. The United States does not have that much. In fact, China is a bigger trading partner with almost all of them. Geopolitically, of very little consequence, but Trump is obsessed with it. Look at what he's doing in Venezuela. So it's a profoundly mistaken view of America's role in the world, where it's as if the only thing that the most powerful country in the history of the world should be worried about is migrants and drug boats, which are concerns, but I mean, the US can handle a lot of things at the same time.
He also seems to like these strongman leaders, these authoritarian leaders like Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin, rather than the democracies of, say, Europe and other places in the world, which is where there should be a natural affinity. What do you make of that personality trait, that he sees Europe and he sees problems rather than seeing allies, which is what European countries actually are for the US?
Well, you put it exactly right. Democratic leaders are always, in a sense, weaker and more compromised and more constrained than a dictatorship. And this is true even of Prime Minister Modi. He has to, he can't make certain concessions, sure, as we were discussing, because agriculture is a big constituency in India. But to me, the biggest strategic error here is if India wants to compete in the world against its one great economic competitor, China, right? If it wants to make sure that it is not dependent on China for critical supplies, for precursor chemicals to pharmaceuticals, solar panels, whatever it is, there is only one country that has the scale to match China, and that's India. And look, in one area which was started under the Biden administration but continued under Trump, India has shown that. Washington's great worry was that it was overly dependent on China for smartphone production. Tapped India 4 years ago. In 4 years, India has become the leading exporter of smartphones in the United States. 44% of all smartphones that come to America are made in India. That's up from
but the tariffs create uncertainty.
There are no tariffs
expansion.
on any of this. There are so many exemptions to all these tariffs.
But they create the specter of uncertainty.
It does. Look, what I'm trying to get at is India has the scale, sure, to match China, and so you should be leaning in on that. And if you want to, on a broader economic strategy, if you want to counter, China's economic heft, you can only do it with Europe, with India, with Japan, with Australia. US by itself, no matter how strong it is, cannot match China because China is 4 times the population. And it has asserted dominance in certain parts of the manufacturing space that US is not going to get back into. The US can't manufacture precursor chemicals for pharmaceuticals, but India can. The US can't do certain kinds of manufacturing, but South Korea and Japan can. So the great advantage the US has is it has these treaties, these allies, who are the richest, most powerful countries in the world. What does China have? It has one formal treaty alliance, North Korea. Okay, let's add Russia. That's it. And so rather than building on the strength of these alliances, what Trump is doing is sort of fighting with the allies, fighting with Europe, fighting with India, rather than using them as an ecosystem that can compete with the Chinese ecosystem.
One of the things that American commentators like Ken Juster or Jake Sullivan have been saying is that India needs to invest more in buying armaments from the United States. I was at a meeting with some of the most important voices in India's defense sector, serving officers as well, and they said, what's happened over the past few months creates immense distrust. Which serving officer will sign off on an acquisition of a highly sensitive, high-tech kind of purchase without having the fear lurking at the back of his head that when you need this weapon to fire, I wonder if the US will allow for that to happen.
And it's a particular problem in modern weapon systems, because in the old days, when you get a fighter jet, you got the jet. You could service it, you could run it, it's now yours. Today, all sophisticated machinery are essentially a meld of hardware and software.
Sure.
So if, let's say, India wants to get into a military intervention with somebody, and the US disapproves of it, could the US deny them software upgrades? Could they in some way...
Or will the chips work at the right time?
Right, exactly. And so, and I think so that fear is entirely legitimate. And it's one more way in which this policy of Trump's is self-defeating. Because, if you think of it, the fundamental issue we're talking about is it takes decades to build trust, and it takes moments to break trust. And my fear is that what Trump has done has broken trust, not just with India, with Canada, with Europe. And it's going to be a different world, partly because of that, because you can never quite get back the trust that you've lost. You can do some things, but you'll never be back to where you were.
What did you make of Russian President Vladimir Putin's visit to Delhi? I was at the Rashtrapati Bhavan for the state dinner, and often leaders come and nobody's really excited, but everyone there was really charged up because they knew they were in the presence of a person from history. He seems to have quite a lot of appeal in India.
Look, he's a strong man. He's built a kind of mythology around him. I've met him. I've interviewed him. He's a very intelligent guy. He's passionately anti-Western. But I think that the energy in the room that you're describing was a gift from Trump, because this was at a moment where the US had turned its back on India. And so it was nice for India to be able to show that it had friends, that it had countries that respected it. So it's a gift from Donald Trump.
One of the arguments you've been making, Fareed, is that India should not look at high-tech weapon purchases from the United States. But take, for example, the fifth generation fighter aircraft. The US has offered, say, an F-35. It's at least on the table as part of a negotiation. But the Russians are offering co-production, technology transfer, which, given where India is at on the tech curve to produce a fighter aircraft, might not then seem like a bad idea. So is Donald Trump really pushing India to making potentially suboptimal choices, but choices which are justified given the security situation?
Well, look, I think, if you can't trust the Americans, you certainly can trust the Russians less in regard to these things. But the point I was...
Why? Because Russian equipment has always stood by India, and Russia has stood by India when push comes to shove.
Yeah, but the truth is, with Russia, for example, you have no idea what's happening. There's this rule by one man. There is no system. There is no Politburo. Russia could be a very chaotic place. Secondly, it's significantly worse technology. But the broader point that I was making to you, Rahul, is India needs to think about a revolution in military affairs that is taking place because of technology.
Sure.
What I've been to Ukraine many times, and what I've been struck by, when you go out, particularly closer to where the battlefield is, what you see is it's all drone-on-drone warfare. It's all automated. It's all unmanned. Increasingly, artificial intelligence is infused into it. And I'll give you one example. The United States gave Ukraine about 50, I can't remember the exact number, about 50 Abrams tanks. These are the best tanks in the world. Every single one of those tanks was rendered inoperable, was essentially shot by a Russian drone that costs less than $10,000 to make.
Sure.
So these are multi-million-dollar tanks destroyed by thousands of dollars worth of drones. Same thing happened to the Russian Air Force by the Ukrainian drones. So should India be thinking about skipping a generation and investing much more heavily in the defense technology of what I'm confident will be the future, which is unmanned aircraft, unmanned drones, unmanned vehicles, And so before you make a huge purchase on either side, I would think that India should really think about the technological landscape that it faces, what are the likely uses of military force. And I'm not saying I'm sure that that would be the most useful way, but I look at these tanks and these huge expensive jets and aircraft carriers, and I feel like this is a world that is going by. These are all sitting ducks for very cheap automated weaponry that increasingly will have artificial intelligence, which means that, with the tanks, what they do is they go down to the point of vulnerability. A tank has 2 points of vulnerability, the hatch and then underneath. And they go and precisely detonate at that point. Maybe that's the future.
I want to talk to you about the Russia-Ukraine war. It seems President Zelensky has, ceded some space, maybe he's been forced to, and agreed to some of the conditions which should have potentially led to a ceasefire. Right now, Putin doesn't seem interested. How do you see this play out in the coming months?
So Trump had a strategy to end the war in Ukraine. I think it's fair to say that he had a real strategy. it's not one I agree with, but it's basically force the Ukrainians to make all the concessions, threaten them with abandonment if they don't make the concessions, present these concessions to Putin, and Putin will then, agree. The war will be ended. Trump will get the Nobel Peace Prize, as we all know. He's obsessed with that. Now, the problem was he did that. He got Zelensky to make the concessions. He presented that deal to Putin in Alaska, and Putin said no. And Putin said no because, like any good negotiator, he realized he was on a roll. He was getting more and more of what he was asking for. And so he upped the demands. And now his demands are Ukraine can't have an army larger than 600,000 and, et cetera, et cetera. So the challenge now is, will Trump go through with his threat, essentially implied, that he will really cut Ukraine off, which he has already in many substantial ways abandoned it. Intel cooperation is lower, weapons supply is much lower, down to a trickle really. And if he does that, the Ukrainians are in very serious trouble. Or will he understand that, look, the place you need to put the pressure is Russia. That's the party that is not agreeing to the deal. That's where you need to focus your attention.
Farid, we're at the end of 2025. A new year is on the horizon. For those who are watching and they're always wanting to know what you think of geopolitics and geostrategy, what are the key trends you'd want them to look out for in 2026?
For most of my career, when I've thought about this question, you sort of look around the world and ask yourself, where are there crises happening? And how will the United States in particular handle these crises? Today, when I travel around the world, almost everywhere the question is, what is the United States doing to cause disruption and difficulties in my part of the world? And how will we manage the American disruption? So it's a very different dynamic that's taking place. So ultimately, honestly, I do think that the single most important question that none of us have an answer to is, what will America's mood, role, policy be in a world going forward? So far, it does feel like Trump is acting in the way we've been describing. World of great powers, pay attention to Russia, China, don't pay a lot of attention to the others. That world is going to be a world of dog eat dog, a world where might makes right. It's not a very attractive world after 8 decades of an open, rule-based international system.
If you were writing a book right now and projecting out a decade later, what do you think the world order in 2035 looks like?
Well, I feel like I've already written it. It's called the post-American world. Because I think what has happened is the United States, and this is what I predicted in the book, that the United States, the problem is going to be not that China is so strong or that Russia is so strong, but that the United States will lose the desire and the internal capacity to play the kind of central organizing role it's played in the world. And so the question is, what comes after that? Will there be a kind of free-for-all? Will other countries freelance? Or, what's interesting is, if you want to look at the hopeful side, on the trade side, the US has gone from being the world's leading free trade power to the world's leading protectionist power in 6 months. The rest of the world didn't go along with that. In Europe in particular, did not retaliate with tariffs, and so we don't have a global trade war. That's the big difference between today and the 1930s. And so maybe there is a realization around the world that, look, the whole world has benefited from an open international system with rules and the convention that you don't just invade your neighboring country and acquire territories. And so maybe what we'll see is a kind of coalition of countries that want to maintain this order, even if the United States is less interested. And by the way, I would very much hope India would be a leading part of that, get that coalition.
And finally, what does a post-Trump United States look like? Now, does it kind of revert back to the mean, or has Trump taken it in a direction from where the US doesn't come back? Because we don't know potentially what a J.D. Vance presidency hypothetically could look like. Could it be more of the same or worse, or does it revert back to the mean?
So remember, Trump is very unpopular in the United States right now. He is essentially the lowest approval ratings of any president in American history. But he has his base, which is very substantial and very committed to him no matter what he does. Like I've never seen anything like that. The level of commitment of his base, that is his strength. That's why he never, he tries very hard to keep that base happy because they are with him through thick and thin. So that means the nature of American debate has changed. And after 8 decades of a certain kind of broad strategic continuity, you have a debate in the United States about how to engage with the world. Now, I think that means we're in for a period of volatility and back and forth. So when, not just Democrats get back into power, but maybe a moderate Republican gets back into power, that policy will probably be much more in continuity with America's long-standing global role. But if a MAGA person like J.D. Vance gets in, I think all bets are off.
Farid, we've been speaking of geopolitics. I want to spend a moment on Desi politics because typically when you look at the rest of the world, 11, 12 years of being in power leads to anti-incumbency catching up, a certain fatigue in government. In the Bihar elections we saw recently, the BJP and the JDU win much bigger than they have over the past 20 years. Why do you think anti-incumbency is not catching up? What do you make of it? And the fact that the opposition in India simply can't seem to get its act in order?
I think there are a variety of things. First, remember, India is growing at roughly 6.5%. It's the fastest growing large economy in the world. In that circumstance, broadly speaking, there is a degree of contentment. There isn't that much pain, discontent, feeling I need to throw the bums out. I think that's one piece of it. Secondly, the BJP is a well-organized party that works very hard at elections. I think there's no question that it does that. I do think there are some issues with how free and fair the vote is, but I don't think that changes the reality that the BJP is a very well-oiled machine with regard to all of this stuff. And I think finally, Modi has been able to play this role of the outsider-insider in a very clever way, where, if you think about it, all politics over the last 10 years have been a revolt against the elites, the urban elites, the secular elites, the cosmopolitan elites. If you think of Erdogan in Turkey, Modi in India, Trump in the US, all these European populists, Modi somehow has been able, and in a way Trump is like this, to be prime minister and yet to be the symbol of the outside man, of the chaiwala. That's a very unusual skill. So I think a lot of it is because of that. And finally, I think something Ruchir Sharma said on your Walk the Talk, the ability to deliver patronage very quickly and efficiently is surely an unintended aspect of Aadhaar. But it is true that if you look at the Bihar elections, I mean, I can't remember the number, but there was a huge amount of money pumped into as patronage. And, the people do react to that. I mean, economic incentives matter.
No, but let's just zoom out. When you look at other leaders who've been, say, 2.5 years in power, 2.5 terms in power, what would you compare the Modi rule with? Because as a student of world history, what does, say, 11 years of Modi compare with in a global context?
So most of the time when you look at leaders, after about 10 years, they start to lose it. They lose it both, it becomes a closed court, they become very arrogant, they become unresponsive. Think of Margaret Thatcher, Helmut Kohl, and it leads to their downfall. In Modi's case, you don't see that. He's going strong. Part of it is a weak opposition. Part of it is he's very disciplined. This is his life, this is what he does. And I think part of it is that he has figured out a way to manage the complexity of Indian politics, alliance politics, actually even better, I would say, than he did right at the start of his term, if you think about lower castes, for example. But, one has to say, part of it is he's more disciplined. He's disciplined. He does not seem to be fatiguing when he gets a setback as the Lok Sabha elections. He learns from it. So there's a degree of kind of vitality that remains. But I suspect that the issue is a weak opposition. Look, I mean, with all this, as you know, the BJP gets, 36% of the vote. The Congress gets 25% of the vote. You could imagine if you could find a charismatic leader or a coalition.
The Congress is down to 19-20, but sure, the allies together.
Yeah, I'm thinking of the alliance.
UPA, yeah,
if you look at the UPA, which is a pretty tight alliance, I mean, I think they would stay together. you know, maybe it would, you could imagine it changing, but I do think, you know, it's why I've said that Modi is probably the most consequential prime minister since Nehru. Certainly, there are only 3 consequential prime ministers, I think, in Indian history: Nehru, Indira Gandhi, and Modi, who have had kind of seismic effect. And he's reshaped politics. He's reshaped the nature of the kind of master narrative of Indian history, you know, which was a Nehruvian narrative, and he's changed that. Maybe that gives him an extra, you know, a dose.
Modi's big hope is to fundamentally recast Indian politics from a Nehruvian mold to a new BJP, Modi, centre-right kind of mold. It's impossible to say for sure, but if you zoom out and project into the future, do you think he would have been able to do that?
I think he, look, I wonder about this, because the India I grew up in was much more, you know, it's an interesting thing. The India I grew up in was much more socialist and regulated and poor, but it was also at the same time much more pluralistic and diverse and secular, and celebrated diversity with a certain kind of real passion and joy. And now what you see is an India that is much richer, much better economic management, booming economically, but where some of those other metrics have decayed, you know, whether it's freedom of the press, whether it's independence of the judiciary, whether it's, you know, a secular outlook. My own sense has always been that India is inherently a very diverse, pluralistic country. There's so many differences. It's a civilization that is, you know, pretending in a sense to be one single country, because it has so many linguistic, regional, religious, ethnic, caste differences. And I also think that my understanding of Hinduism is that it is a very tolerant religion. It is the most tolerant religion I can think of. I mean, there's no other religion I can think of where you can be a vegetarian and say that is a core part of my belief, and be a non-vegetarian and believe the same thing. You can believe in one God, you can believe in 100. You can, you know, the ability to coexist and live and let live it seems to me at the essence of Hinduism. So my own feeling is, at the end of the day, that celebration of diversity and pluralism will resurface. You know, politics goes in waves, and I think that we are clearly in the wave you're describing, one defined by a certain kind of Hindu nationalism. But I'm not convinced that that's forever. You know, I mean, one thing I've learned the older I get, nothing is forever. Things change.
And that's why we need to keep walking the talk. Thank you very much, Fareed Zakaria, for this masterclass in geopolitics. It's been an absolutely fascinating weekend. Wish you all the very best. Have a safe trip back.
Thank you, Ron.
Thank you.